Hello everyone, this is the 1 hour interview. I am Grigory Antimony, and with great pleasure I would like to introduce our guest. This is Yuri Felshtinsky, historian, writer, and my old friend. That's why I will speak on the first name basis. Okay, let's start from the beginning. 8 years ago, you wrote a book. I have it right here, and it is called The Third World War, Battle for Ukraine. I have to say that I wasn't the only one who was a bit skeptical about this book, and I have to say it frankly, that these expectations and predictions that you described in this book, we didn't take them seriously. But I would like to ask you this: when you have had this conviction that the war would begin. Actually, the next day the Russian troops entered Crimea. The next day after the troops entered Crimea, I wrote the first article about it, and the article was called The Third World War. That was the title of the first article that I wrote the next day after Russia's invasion of Crimea. It's actually quite strange because, remembering those years, back then many politicians and journalists were thinking that it will be a local conflict in the region of Donbass, including the invasion of Crimea. What grounds did you have to think that that was the Third World War, the beginning of it? Well, first of all, I wrote this article even before Donbass was invaded. Yes, after Crimea. Donbass was invaded. But the title, The Third World War, had to do with the invasion of Crimea. The grounds I had to write like that, because by 2014 the Russian leadership said and did a lot to indicate that they have this crazy desire to revive the old Soviet Union or maybe a new Russian Empire. A lot of things happened even before March of 2014. What they did in 2000, they returned the old Soviet anthem. They also returned a very famous tune of the news program of the Soviet time that was called Время, the time. TASS, the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union, the news agency, this name was returned in September of 2014. In 2007, Putin had his Munich speech. By March, before they invaded Crimea, he stated that the collapse of the Soviet Union is his personal tragedy and geopolitical disaster. And he also said that he was quite unhappy with NATO expansion. But it should be said that in 1998, when Putin became a prime minister, he personally stated, and back then his statement confused many people, that Russia was actually seriously considering joining NATO. To a certain point, the Russian leadership did not consider NATO as a hostile organization. This concept that NATO was a hostile organization and other countries joining NATO was actually a threat to Russia's security, this fairy tale appeared later. But the main thing is that in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. And for the first time since 1991, Russian troops were engaged abroad. So when in March of 2014 the Russian army invaded Crimea and annexed Crimea, it was clear to me that they are realizing a big plan to restore the Soviet Union. And this plan, naturally, would have to include Ukraine. Of course, if we're talking about a restoration of the Soviet Union, there can't be any Soviet empire without Ukraine. But from all those signs of the time that you mentioned, I wasn't quite convinced with the return of the Soviet anthem and the return of the TASS news agency name. These are kind of secondary signs. But his Munich speech, that was quite a serious step, where he stated his resentment, and somehow this resentment should be implemented. Then let's start with this real war beginning. What happened on the 24th of February of 2022? From your expectations and predictions, what actually came true? I can probably make a list of certain points related to this. What was the most significant thing that surprised the whole world? That was the resistance of the Ukrainian army. Nobody was actually expecting this. And the resistance of the Ukrainian people. Secondly, this is the personality of President Zelensky. Nobody expected that there will be such a powerful transformation and he will become a leader not only of Ukraine, but maybe of the whole Western world. And that's an important point. And thirdly, that was an unexpected consolidation of the West, facing this real threat. And two more points that have to do with Russia. People were surprised with the real state of the Russian army, considering it kind of the second army in the world, and also the degree of cruelty of this war. Nobody expected that. Nobody could predict that. Did I list everything? Yes, all the points are right and valid, and let us go through all of them. But before that, I would like to make a couple of steps back, kind of to the period before February of 2022. What happened in 2014? They took over Crimea without a fight, and of course it sent a false signal to Putin and Russia. And I think that he considered that the rest of Ukraine will be given to him without a fight. That's why, if you remember, there was a whole wave of all these separatist movements, and they also declared referendums that some of the regions of Ukraine want to leave Ukraine. And they began the military actions in Donbass. And it turned out that in Donbass, that Ukrainians are resisting. Comparing to Crimea, where there was no any fight, in Donbass, they actually had quite a significant resistance of Ukraine. And it was a very difficult positional war, and it continued till the 24th of February of 2022. And Putin slowed down back then, and he did it because the Ukrainian army resisted, but also because it was clear that from the point of view of the military, the operation to take over Ukraine should be started from the north. And in this book that was published in 2015, I also wrote that we need to watch Belarus, what's going on there, because Belarus was kind of a litmus paper. And as soon as we see Russian troops in Belarus, this is the time to cry, watch out, because it means that Russia is getting ready for an offensive on Ukraine. So they published a book, and all of us, me included, we kind of missed this whole element of Belarus. Maybe because of the COVID, maybe because of some events in Belarus and those protests against Lukashenko after the election in 2020, and how those protests were oppressed. and as part of this, Russian troops were brought to Belarus. So in short, by February of 2022, Belarus was already an occupied territory. And it meant not only that Russia got quite important geopolitical bridgehead to get to the borders of the Eastern European countries, but also Russia got a bridgehead to start its offensive on Kiev, because it was clear in order to take over Ukraine, they need to start an offensive on Kiev. That should be a direction of the main strike. And this is how it was in February. So when they started bringing together their troops, all people who were watching these developments, me included, we were split into two groups. One group thought that this is a bluff and Putin will never begin a war against Ukraine, and everything that is done there is done to pressure Ukraine in order to get some concessions. The second group that I belong to, and we were in minority, we thought that Putin will start a full-scale war. Why did I think that? In March of 2014, when Crimea was annexed, and of course the West introduced some sanctions, but let's be frank, those sanctions were not serious. I was collecting those statements from different places, from the US, from Europe, and all those statements were sending this one signal to Putin, kind of tell us that this is going to be the end of your foreign policy ambitions, and we will find a way to settle this conflict, and we will move on. So they were saying this to settle the conflict at the expense of Ukraine. Yes, of course. And let's be fair and objective. Ukrainians preferred not to shout loudly that somebody waged a war against them. Nobody was saying the word war in Ukraine in connection to annexation of Crimea or war in Donbass. Ukraine didn't stop its diplomatic relationships with the Russian Federation even after the military operation started in Donbass. Actually, Georgia stopped its diplomatic relationship with Russia after the invasion of Georgia in 2008. Ukraine kept paying its gas debt to the Russian Federation after the Crimea was annexed and after they started military actions in Donbass. What should be said also that Ukraine joined the sanctions of the Western countries, I think in 2015, maybe the last one who did that. Up to 2018, I have to tell you this, Russian military trains were led through Ukrainian territory to Transnistria to support Russian troops in that region. In fact, Ukraine did as much as it could to help the West, or to let West settle this Crimea conflict, and to allow Putin to keep Crimea without really saying that there was a war or military actions. So let's not judge anyone for that. Maybe there were some objective circumstances for that. I can also tell you that, what I think about it. Since Ukraine back then didn't really have a real army to be ready for real warfare, Ukraine couldn't get engaged in a direct military conflict. For Ukraine, it was more important to sign those Minsk Accords And yes, and it should be underlined that those accords were a garrote on Ukrainians' neck. However, I'm a historian. I have this historian approach to events, even to modern events. And it looked that Crimea, invasion of Crimea, is just the beginning. And I remember one of our interviews back then was even called Crimea is just the beginning. When Putin was offered to keep Crimea and to limit himself to Crimea, and when he refused to do that, it was clear that Crimea is just the beginning. So now we get to those points that you listed, and all of them are valid. For Putin, bluff is always a foundation to get the results he wants. And as we know now, on the 25th of February, Putin ordered Lukashenko to call Zelensky and ask Zelensky to surrender in exchange for stopping military actions. And Zelensky refused. Putin's plan was very simple. Yes, nobody was expecting that the Ukrainian army will begin to resist and Ukraine as a whole will be resisting. And Putin was the first one who didn't expect that. But let's be objective. Nobody expected that. Do you remember the state of the Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war? All they had from the Western weapons were Stinger rocket launchers and Bayraktar drones, and that's practically it. I think after the war, when we have more time to analyze what was happening, and we will be able to say how the Ukrainian army was able to stop so-called second army in the world. Putin's plan was that by today probably he would be standing on the border of Germany, because the idea was quite simple. He is taking over Kiev for 1 week or two, then Yanukovych is put back as a legitimate president in Ukraine. So Ukraine will be pacified, and all this Russian armada will be moving to Transnistria. In Transnistria, they wage a similar war. Moldova, comparing to Ukraine, of course, a small country and a weak country. And keeping in mind that Putin already took over Belarus in 2021 before invasion of Ukraine. So Putin is actually realizing his plan to restore the Soviet Union within the borders of Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And then he is moving to the Baltic countries. It's very hard to prove that they actually had this particular plan, but I am absolutely confident that this plan included invasion of the Baltic countries. We can say it now in 2022. As we know today, Putin made a mistake miscalculating the military capabilities of the Ukrainian army. But he didn't make a mistake about what the West fears the most. And it turns out it is a nuclear conflict with the Russian Federation. So he thought, since NATO will be afraid of provoking a nuclear conflict, and NATO doesn't really have land forces in Europe, he will be able to take over the Baltic countries. And when he does that, he will destroy NATO system, he will destroy the EU, Russia will get with its land forces to Kaliningrad and gets to the border of Germany, and the Eastern Europe will be in the zone of influence of this new Russian Federation, new Russian Empire, or whatever. That was the plan for 2022. This plan was completely destroyed by Ukraine. Russia lost its army, was unable to conquer Ukraine, and was bogged in Ukraine. So you mentioned Zelensky. It's clear that the war is won by Ukraine, by the Ukrainian army, by the Ukrainian people. But this war was won by Zelensky. He won this war at that point. First time he won it, and probably it was expected, when he refused to surrender. But the second time, when he's finally won it, when he refused to leave Kiev. Good evening, everyone. Leaders of party factions are here. Head of the presidential office is here. Prime Minister Shmyhal is here. Podolyak, the advisor to the president, is here. The president is here. All of us are here. Our military is here. Civil society is here. We're all here. We are defending our independence. We are defending our country, and that's how it's going to be. Glory to our defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. In fact, he was offered everything. He was offered to immigrate abroad and to set a cabinet in exile. Actually, this is what the Poles did after September 1939. He was offered to go to Lviv and to govern from there. But when he decided not to leave Kiev, he won the war, because at this point the Russian offensive on Kiev failed. And without this offensive, it's impossible to win the war in Ukraine. And as a result, Russia lost its army. On the 21st of September, as we know, Putin declared mobilization of 300,000 soldiers. By the end of his speech, all 300,000 people fled the country, ran abroad. Somebody flew by plane, some people ran away by train, some went by foot. So actually Putin lost its army even before he was able to put it together. But in fact, he enlisted the number he needed. Well, yes, from the point of view of us who are looking at the war from the outside of Russia, Putin lost the war. From the point of view of Putin, nothing irreversible happened. Because Russia is a country with unlimited human resources, and this is how it is. According to any calculations, with any adjustments of those 300,000 people that left the country, I would say that the human resources are still about a couple of millions. Well, roughly speaking, this reserve is about 18 to 21 million people, those whom he can mobilize. I mean, that reserve that can be mobilized immediately, these 2 million, I mean. Historically, Russia had that always. And Russia used to lose more people in wars than any other country. Human life doesn't cost anything in Russia. Putin doesn't give a damn about how many thousands, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers die in Ukraine. Somehow, the more people die in Ukraine, the greater he feels. And we have an example of Stalin, who slaughtered numerous soldiers in the war, and the more he slaughtered, the greater he was becoming. So that's why Putin doesn't care. From a certain point, there are more and more statements and talks, and I think one of them was yesterday, and Patrushev said that Russia is not fighting Ukraine, Russia is fighting NATO. That actually changed their self-perception. Because it's one thing when Russia is losing to Ukraine, the country that Putin wrote a whole treatise saying that there is no such a country, there is no such a language, so nothing like that exists. But then it turns out that he can't actually conquer this territory. So that's why his goals didn't change, and this is very important. The goals are the same. They're the same in terms of conquering Ukraine, advancing to Moldova, conquering the Baltic countries, and restoring his Eastern European influence. So are you sure that in case of conquering this tiny country of Estonia, where they probably have just a company of NATO troops, so don't you think that in this case there will be an adequate response of NATO or of the United States? So will American troops die for Estonia? Well, American troops will die for Estonia, but for American troops to die for Estonia, they have to be in Estonia in sufficient numbers. The situation now is changing very quickly, and I will explain you why and what is changing. Now we are talking about Putin's plans for March and April of 2022. And by that time, in Europe, they didn't have land troops of NATO. They had some troops, but very limited. And only after Madrid papers were signed, they decided to increase the rapid deployment forces of NATO from 40,000 to 300,000. And they decided to do it only now. And those 40,000 troops that were scattered across Europe were not enough to resist so-called Second Army of the World that accounted for 200,000 troops, and in fact more than that, because Putin was planning to bring Ukrainians to this army, to bring the troops from Transnistria and also Belarus army. That's why the armada that Putin was preparing for further advancement to the Eastern Europe was quite huge. And it wasn't incidental that after 24th of February, Putin said that he is unhappy with the borders that were set in 1991, and he also said that he was unhappy with the borders that were set in 1918, and that included Finland too. He said that he wants to restore the influence that the Soviet Union used to have over the Eastern Europe. So all this was happening at the end of February, beginning of March, when he openly started this aggression, this Third World War. I still think the 24th of February, still after 10 months and the destruction of the forward echelon of the Russian army, I still think that the 24th of February will be put in history textbooks sometime later as the beginning of the Third World War. And the question still remains, and it's a serious question: how long will this war last? And what price we, the West and the civilized world, have to pay for the victory?
Когда мы заступили первый раз на эвакуацию, поезд мы прозвали «Летучий голландец».
Всі були дуже налякані.
У нас не было ни графика, ни времени, ни расписаний, ни станций.
Я стояла на посадці і одного разу пролунав дуже потужний вибух. Я озирнулась, а людей стільки, що навіть тікати нікуди.
Мы объявили пассажирам не дышать, не шевелиться. А машинисту, вот я не знаю его фамилии, но если бы мы бы его нашли бы, я бы ему в ноги поклонилась бы, честно, от чистой души поклонилась бы.
Там зриваються, там падають на перон.
Діти маленькі кричали, багато хто свідомість втрачав.
Був жах, не день, а жах просто. Він не скінчувався. Це був один безкінечний день. Просто зранку до вечора.
Тоже раненый тепловоз встретился с братьями-рашистами. Ну ничего, починим, отремонтируем.
Вікна темні, все темно. І з якогось з одних вагонів просвітляється лице дитини. Саме більше, що мене вразило, йшла настільки пара з вагону, що я думав, що там щось горить. Я не пам'ятаю, скільки тисяч людей з нього вийшло.
Оп, автомат. Що це за город? Я кажу, це не город, це село. Каже, зачем ти мене обманюєш? Каже, у вас тут освіщення, асфальт.
Когда мы въехали в Краматорск, я реально понимаю, что на перроне стоит, 1008 человек.
Єдиний міст, який сполучає Краматорськ з рештою України.
Под обстрелами ребята, путейщики, восстанавливали мост.
Бачили, як над головою літали снаряди.
Це взагалі унікальна ситуація. І вся нація об'єдналася для того, щоб все зробити, щоб перемогти.
Люди рятували як могли тварин, котів, собак, рибку в пакеті. Це наша нація. Мені здається, що в цьому наша й сила. Ми рятуємо все живе.
Дуже люблю вас. Не можу без вас.
Yes, Ukraine managed to deter Russian invasion. Yes, Ukraine now and forever prevented this invasion of the Russian armada. And actually, seeing what's happening in Ukraine, we understand what Ukraine saved Europe from. Everything that we see today in Ukraine would be happening in the Eastern Europe. So this is what Ukraine saved Europe from. So, and again, when the war is over, for a long, long time, we will be thanking Ukraine for what it did. But nevertheless, Ukraine has powers to deter Russia's attacks. However, Ukraine doesn't have enough power to push occupiers from the occupied territory. Sadly for Ukraine, there might be explanations and justifications for that. Europe and NATO are helping Ukraine, just enough for Ukraine to keep fighting back, but not enough to actually win in this war. Well, this statement is commonly known, but can you tell us why? You mean why NATO is doling out its help? Yes, of course I can. I think there are two reasons or 2 points of view on what's going on. And probably they're not even contradictory, they probably complement each other. And one of them is the main one, and it's obvious. It is that NATO is afraid of provoking a nuclear conflict with Russia. Since it's not obvious that Russia will be able to put together a new army, though I do think that Russia might do it by April or March of this year, And I can actually suppose that Russia might undertake a second attempt to attack Kiev, because without this, Putin cannot move forward in this war. He can't do it without the second attempt to conquer Kiev. I don't think this attempt may be successful. It may be a failure, just like the first one, but he can't move anywhere without really trying it. Besides, it looks like Putin doesn't have any other moves but to use nuclear weapons, and this is what NATO is afraid of and what Europe is afraid of. And do you think Putin is not afraid of that? Well, Putin is afraid of that, because if he wasn't afraid of that, he would use nuclear weapons already. I can even argue that the longer the war goes, the more chances are that Putin will use nuclear weapons. And that's a psychological matter. Something we didn't expect or didn't think about, something that we weren't ready in February of 2022. We gradually kind of shifting in that direction, and that regards Putin too. We kind of becoming more understanding this war may turn into a nuclear war. A year ago we didn't think so, today we do. And in this sense, I think it would be right to finish this war as soon as possible, and it can be done only in one way, by changing Western view of this war. You can't look at this war as a defensive war. You can't look at this war as a war that should be kept within the borders of Ukraine. So if the main goal is to keep the war within Ukrainian borders, then it leads us to only one thing, that Putin can do whatever he wants without any punishment. He can destroy Ukraine from the air, and while doing this, he can be putting together a new army, and as soon as the army is ready, he can undertake a new attempt to conquer Ukraine. And by that point, Ukraine will be pretty much destroyed from the air. So to weaken Ukraine like this, it's not for the benefit of the West. The only consideration that the West may have, and that nobody is actually saying it, and clearly why, and this consideration is this: the longer the war goes, the better understanding the leaders of NATO, Europe, Canada, and the US have that the global, full-scale conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation is inevitable. And they have to get ready for it. But in order to do that, they need time. And so far, this time is bought for them by Ukraine. And that's probably the only reasonable consideration, reasonable from the point of view of NATO. This is what exists. And obviously they don't say it out loud, and we know why. So, Yuri, do you think that Putin is sure that he can win a nuclear war? Otherwise, it's kind of senseless. It's pure blackmail. Well, you see, this assumption that a nuclear war can be won, this is a double-edged weapon. This is a question that can be addressed to NATO leadership. But according to this logic, maybe a nuclear war cannot be won, but it cannot be lost either. So, and I think that this is a mindset that Putin has. That's why from time to time we hear from different level of Russian leadership or from its propagandists that Russia has few thousands of nuclear heads, so Russia cannot lose the war because a country with nuclear weapons cannot lose a war. And maybe there is certain truth in it, but with significant adjustment, which means this country cannot win this war either. Well, if we assume that Putin is not mad, so is it possible that, knowing that he can't win this war, he is sort of aiming for self-destruction? Well, it's a complex matter. Hitler started World War II on the 1st of September 1939. On the 1st of September, Hitler didn't understand he is beginning a big war, and he had no idea that this will turn into a world war. And on the 1st of September of 1939, he didn't understand that he's actually signing his death sentence to himself, to his regime, and to the great Germany that took him so much pain to build. So when we say that a leader doesn't understand something, but actually when we look back and it seems things were just obvious, it was easy to see that. So if a leader doesn't understand something, it doesn't mean that he will not take certain steps. So in this book, in my second book that is called From the Red Terror to Mafia State, it was actually published before the beginning of the war in 2021, together with my co-author, Vladimir Popov. We wrote that Putin created in Russia an absolutely stable regime, and he can remain a president up to 2036. It's right here on the book cover. Well, actually, he can stay in power till the very end of his days. Yes, right. But with only one exception, it can be like that. Unless he starts a big war. If he starts a big war, he signs a death sentence to himself, to his system, to the Russian state, in its form and shape that exists today. And on the 24th of February, Putin began this war. And I know that this book was delivered to Putin at the end of 2021. Maybe he didn't have time to read it. But does he have any moves to retreat? No, he's not going to make them. And we shouldn't count on that. What Putin is counting for is the following. In all his steps, as we mentioned, there is an element of bluff. On the 24th of February, he began the military actions, and on the 25th of February, Lukashenko called Zelensky. And let's assume, but I'm historian, I don't have the right for that, but let's assume Zelensky said, okay, I surrender. So, which means the bluff worked. Then we will be sitting here and discussing, so how interesting it is that there were all those people who were saying it's bluff, and those people were right, and it was bluff, and bluff actually worked out. But the bluff didn't work out, as we know. And Putin had to begin the war. And the war is going completely unexpected, not according to the scenario that he was counting for. That's why he had to declare an additional mobilization. That's why they're discussing the issue of lack of weapons. That's why they have to enlist prisoners to the army. That's why there is a total chaos in the army. Everything is miscalculated. A lot of things were unexpected. And so the best minds of the Russian Federation now working on a new bluff. And this bluff may be implemented later. For example, that Russia can launch a nuclear strike on Ukraine. So NATO already said, since Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so Russia shouldn't expect a nuclear strike in response. So that could be assumed. NATO didn't have to announce that, but they did. Yuri, maybe you remember that at the beginning of the war, every morning of President Biden started with reassurances that none of the American soldiers will get to Ukraine to protect its territory. That was like a morning mass, and whom he was addressing it to was unclear. And at the same time, he was also making assurances that NATO will be protecting every inch of NATO territory, which meant that territories of the countries that are not NATO members will not be protected by NATO. And by the way, needless to say that it wasn't necessary to speak about it out loud, because at that point Biden kind of forgot that Finland and Sweden were not members of NATO, and in response to that, he was reminded by the Russian Federation that Finland used to be a part of Russian Empire, and Finland and Sweden, they had to immediately join NATO, and I hope they managed to do that. Many things were said, the things that didn't need to be said or could be put differently. But nevertheless, one of the bluffs that we heard, that Russia may launch a nuclear strike on Ukraine. The second bluff that we heard was from Lukashenko, that Belarus can launch a nuclear strike on Poland and Lithuania. And besides that, we witnessed how Lukashenko removed Belarus from non-nuclear status, and after recent Putin's visit to Minsk, Lukashenko announced that he will equip the Belarus aircraft with special weapons. So, to make it clear, they were missiles with nuclear warheads. So those are bluffs or blackmail. This is a new blackmail. Let me add another blackmail, gas blackmail. So they were saying they will stop providing gas for Europe, Europe will freeze. Well, actually, this blackmail was somehow realized. Though being realized, it didn't quite work. It's clear now. In fact, after 24th of February, and maybe we don't quite understand it yet, the world changed. We live in a completely different world, and we live in this different world in different areas of this world. Well, first of all, Ukraine, that many people didn't know, not only Putin, whether this country existed or not. So now everybody knows that Ukraine exists. Secondly, which is also very important, there was this long discussion going on whether to join NATO or not. Should Ukraine join the EU or not? In fact, Ukraine de facto is member of NATO, and Ukraine is part of EU, because when you have millions of your citizens that are living and work in Europe, so de facto Ukraine is the member of the European Union. And thirdly, there are two leading countries in continental Europe. This is Germany and France. Let's be frank, that after 24th of February, when the invasion began, many leading politicians of Germany and France would give everything for Ukraine surrendering. And then they could sort of kind of shrug and say, so what could we do? Of course we are unhappy that Putin occupied Ukraine, but look, Ukraine did not resist. What could we do? So we'll just have to live with what we have, just put up with it. So I think maybe not only Germany and France, but Germany and France were sort of on the foreground. Both Germany and France, as a result of this 10 months of war, they have to understand that never, ever, the Eastern Europe will go under the influence of Russia, whether it's Soviet, Russian control, whatever control. So this freedom that they got in 1991 will never be given back to anybody. And of course, the sooner they understand it in Germany and France, it would be better, because I think Americans understand that. But Germans and the French, I'm not so sure about it. The sooner they understand it, the easier for them would be to come to the conclusion that this war should be ended as soon as possible, and to end it not through surrender of Ukraine, but through the defeat of Russia. Then we will be able to avoid nuclear war, the Third World War. Well, of course, it's impossible to achieve that with the current position of the West, of NATO. I mean, the supply of the weapons that Ukraine needs. It's impossible to win this war when there are such stupid restrictions the United States put on itself. It's just impossible. When they prohibit to make strikes on the territory of the aggressor and many other things. I think that the most reasonable position is kind of moderate, but yet self-sufficient. What General Zaluzhny said, don't give us more than Russia has, just give us adequate weapons. He said parity weapons, and that will be enough. Well, in fact, there are two things here. Well, first of all, it's a political decision. And the political decision of the West is that the West has to look at this war as an offensive war with the forces of Ukraine, and they need to start give Ukraine offensive weapons. And I think gradually the West is moving towards that direction. It's not a problem that they're not moving to that direction, but they're doing it very slowly. The problem is the speed. And as a result, on the scale, we have what's going to happen sooner. Shift of the West to the right side, to the right direction, or the speed of the destruction of Ukraine by Putin from the air. I'm not a military expert and I cannot answer this question, but if in February we were discussing the necessity of NATO to be engaged in this war, and as you fairly said that every morning Biden was saying that none of the American soldiers will be fighting in Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't need NATO soldiers. Ukraine, after 10 months of the war, has now the most numerous and most capable army in Europe. NATO today doesn't have an army that would be adequate to Ukrainian army and the army that could resist the Russian army. All Ukraine needs is weapons. They have the army, they have readiness to fight and die, and not many people have this readiness. And they even have the territory where they can have a warfare. But I believe that the Baltic countries can die for their freedom, but they don't have a territory where they can have the military actions with their such huge army. Maybe this army is stupid and a bad army, but it's big army. Big army of the Russian Federation. That's why the stupidest thing that can be done from political point of view and from the military point of view is to allow Putin to destroy Ukraine, because by doing so you are decreasing the level of NATO capability to resist Russian aggression. But it's not the main problem. The problem is that they still don't understand in Russia that they can't lose this war, and they don't think that they can lose this war because they have nuclear weapons, and it's quite a serious trump card. Maybe it's the only trump card they have. But going back to the bluff and to the escalation of aggression, let me say this. Remember when how Putin was saying this, and it was kind of touching how he was saying this. Unfortunately, then it turned into a world war. But before that point, I felt kind of sorry for him every time he was saying this. He was kind of saying this like this. I'm saying this, but they don't hear me. So hear me out, he was saying. I want Ukraine, I want this, I want that, I want everything, he was saying. He was saying, kind of hear me out. So I invaded Ukraine. Did you hear me? Oh, you didn't hear me? Okay, fine. So I'm going to destroy all this unexisted country from the air. Maybe then you will hear me. Maybe it was his main message of the Munich speech. Yes, his main message was hear me out. Maybe that speech should have been called hear me out. Yes, hear me out, he was saying. I think that at some point he was thinking that all of them will get together and will make a decision. Because now we know how Russia is run. Russia is run by three people: by Putin, Patrushev, head of the Security Council, and Bortnikov, head of FSB. There were five people who were making decision to invade Crimea: with Putin, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Shoigu, Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, head of the General Staff. When at some point we'll get all the documents, we historians, I'm sure, we will learn that the General Staff, as usually, was against the military action, as they were against the war in Afghanistan. But General Staff is kind of technical body, so nobody listens to them. The FSB board is responsible for everything. When Patrushev, Putin, and Bortnikov get together, and they'll make a decision whether they should launch a nuclear strike on Vilnius and Warsaw or not. But if they do, what's going to happen? When later Putin might call Macron and say, now, do you hear me? So it's not the problem, though. The problem is that there is no room for negotiations, because Putin wants everything. Macron can call him every day, and maybe he's still doing it. And he can say to him, Vlad, do you agree to stop the war? And Vlad would say, yes, tomorrow, no problem. Tomorrow, I'm ready to stop the war, tomorrow. And then Macron would say, what do you need for that, Vlad? And Putin would say, everything. But see, under these terms, nobody can do negotiations. And that's the reason why the war is not going to end through negotiations. In fact, I don't know wars in the history, the wars that would be finished through negotiations. The wars when on both sides they killed hundreds of thousands of people. This war cannot be ended through negotiations. It will end only when one of the sides will be defeated. And since we know that this side cannot be NATO, we know that this side will be Russian Federation. But again, we again walk in this vicious circle of the possibility of a nuclear strike. Sadly, our time is up, and we will continue this conversation. And I'll remind you that our guest was a writer and historian Yuri Felshtinsky, and I say goodbye and see you next Saturday. Thank you.